I'm 28 years old, and a few months ago I let my younger brother, who's 24, move in with me. Back in high school and through college, he was the kind of guy who lived for parties, and he basically wasted those years doing nothing useful. His grades were awful, he had zero work experience, and not surprisingly, he couldn't land a decent job afterward. The problem is, he refuses to even consider low-paying jobs because, in his words, he's destined for bigger things. My parents were the ones who asked me to take him in for a while, hoping that if he lived with me, he might finally pick up some independence. When he was at their house, all he did was sit in his room gaming, and anytime they tried to bring up getting a job, he'd lose his temper and complain that everyone was pushing him too hard. I really did care about him, honestly. I doted on him most of my life, and even up until just a few weeks ago, I still had that soft spot. So when my parents asked, I agreed. He was more than happy to move in. But once he did, the first couple of weeks looked exactly like how it was at our parents' place. He didn't change a single thing, so I decided I had to step in and try steering him in the right direction. I sat him down and gave him the talk about how important it is to start working young. I've had a job since my college days, and by the time I graduated, I had enough experience under my belt to land a decent job and live comfortably. My brother had already blown that stage of his life, but I told him he could still turn things around. I reminded him that our parents wouldn't be around forever, and one day I'd have my own family to think about. I wasn't going to be able to support him forever. After that talk, he acted like he took it seriously. He told me he'd start searching for jobs online and focus on improving himself. I wasn't sure if he actually followed through, but whenever I checked in on him, he always looked busy, so I let it be. Then, a couple of months ago, he came to me with what he called a big opportunity. He asked me for access to my savings account, saying that he and his friends were going to open a gaming and electronics store together. He needed money for his share of the investment but didn't want to involve our parents. He promised that once they started making profits, he'd pay me back, or better yet, make me a partner in the business. On paper, it didn't sound like a terrible idea. He and his friends seemed like they had an actual plan, and when I ran it by my parents, they also thought it was promising and encouraged me to help him. One of my close friends, who's a lawyer, was the only one cautious enough to tell me to get it in writing. She said even when it's family, it's risky to leave something this big to trust alone. That advice stuck with me, so I drafted a legal agreement. My brother really hesitated when I asked him to sign it, saying that since we were family, we shouldn't need to worry about things like contracts. That should have been a huge red flag right there. Still, I convinced him it was just a formality, nothing serious, and eventually he gave in only after I promised him it didn't really mean anything. Afterward, I added him to the card linked to my savings account but made the rules crystal clear. He could use half of what I had saved, but no more, unless I gave him explicit permission. He agreed to that. I'd spent the last 8 years saving around $225,000 so I could finally buy a home in the suburbs and move out of my rental. That money represented years of hard work and sacrifices, and it was incredibly important to me. I expected my brother to respect that and stick to the agreement. At most, he was allowed to take about $12,000 without checking in with me, and if he needed more, we'd talk about it. For the first few weeks, I was actually surprised he didn't touch a cent. Then he left to stay with his friends, since they were getting their business started, and I kept an eye on things for a bit. But once I got wrapped up in a new project at work, monitoring the account completely slipped my mind. By the time I finally checked again a few weeks later, my stomach dropped. My account had been completely drained, all $225,000 gone except for a couple $100 left. I was stunned. What made it worse was that during those weeks, I had been in contact with my brother. We talked about how the store was coming along, and he always had positive updates. But not once did he mention anything about expenses, and since I was busy and trusted him, I never asked. I honestly believed he wouldn't cross the line. Turns out, I was wrong. He had emptied out everything I'd worked years to save. The moment I saw my account drained, I called my brother to confront him. At first, he tried brushing it off, saying it must have been some kind of mistake, but even he didn't sound like he believed his own excuse. I pressed him harder, and eventually, he broke down and admitted the truth. He and his friends had gambled it all away and lost every cent. He said he was sorry and claimed he had been trying to win it back, but that he just needed more time. Hearing that sent me over the edge. I was so heartbroken that I didn't even yell or argue. I just hung up and sat there crying for nearly an hour. It crushed me to think that not only had he blown through all of my hard-earned savings, but he'd done it on something as reckless and meaningless as gambling. He knew what that money meant to me. I'd been saving it for years, making sacrifices, working hard, and building toward the future I wanted. And yet, he didn't think twice before betraying me like that. I couldn't wrap my head around the fact that everything I'd saved was simply gone. Deep down, I knew my brother wasn't going to magically fix this or come up with the money on his own. The only small relief was that at least this was just my savings. I still had enough left in my checking account to handle bills and everyday expenses, but that didn't make me feel better. I was furious and devastated. Once I pulled myself together, I called my parents to tell them what happened. They were shocked at first, but instead of standing with me, they urged me to have faith in my brother and give him another chance. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. After what he did, how could they possibly defend him? I told them flat out that either my brother got a job and started paying me back, or they needed to step up and pay me themselves. I reminded them that he had signed a document legally promising to return the loan or make me a partner in his so-called business. And since there was clearly no business, he had no choice but to repay me. I warned them that if he didn't, I'd have no option but to sue him. I honestly didn't want it to come to that because I knew how messy and dramatic it would get for everyone involved, so I gave them an out. But instead of taking responsibility, my parents turned it back on me. They started guilt-tripping me, saying that he was my brother and that taking him to court would be a sin. They wanted me to forgive him, wipe the slate clean, and act like none of this ever happened. They weren't willing to pay me back themselves, and they weren't going to hold him accountable either. That's when it hit me just how selfish and unfair my family really was. I told them plainly that I didn't care about family ties, I cared about my money. And if court was the only way to get it back, then that's what I was going to do. My parents doubled down, telling me that if I went through with it, they'd cut ties with me. To them, I was the villain for daring to stand up for myself. They kept saying he was still young and this was the age where people make mistakes and learn from them. But come on, he's almost 24. At his age, I was already working, paying bills, and taking care of myself. Mistakes are one thing. Deliberately gambling away $225,000 isn't a mistake, it's a choice. At this point, I don't even think the business idea was ever real. If it was all talk with no intention of following through. But I wasn't dwelling on that anymore. All I wanted was my money back. And if that meant standing alone against my family, so be it. So a few weeks ago, I filed a lawsuit against my brother, demanding he repay the money. Just like I expected, my parents completely lost it when he was served. My brother, still living with his friends, freaked out when he found out what I was doing. They all tried everything, apologies, begging, emotional manipulation, to get me to drop the case, but I refused. It wasn't easy because my family has always been my weak spot, but I had to harden myself. My years of effort and savings meant more than their selfish excuses. If they were going to look out only for themselves, then I had to do the same for me. My brother, in particular, tried every trick in the book. He promised he'd pay me back as soon as he could. But I'd heard enough empty promises. He had wasted too much of his life leeching off our parents, and now he thought he could treat me the same way. The truth is, he'd grown into an entitled, ungrateful mess because my parents never set any boundaries with him. And that wasn't my problem to fix. We've already been through a couple of mediation sessions with our lawyers, and the tension has been brutal. I've been angrier than I've ever been, but I can't help it, they refuse to admit what they did and act like they're the victims. To top it off, just a few days ago, my uncle told me something about my brother that completely changed the way I see both him and my parents. And that was when things went from bad to worse. Not long ago, my uncle reached out to me after talking to my mom, his sister. He said he'd heard about the fight between me and my family and decided it was time to come clean about something I had never known. What he told me completely floored me, it was about my college tuition. Back when I first started college, my parents made a huge show of how they were paying for it. They always reminded me that since they were footing the bill, I needed to study hard and make their money worth it, and eventually pay them back. So, for years, I believed I owed them. Turns out, they weren't the ones paying at all. My uncle was. He'd been the one funding my tuition the entire time, through loans he gave to my mother. And the reason? My parents wanted to redirect their money so they could send my brother to a private school. What makes it even worse is that I'd actually gotten into my first choice college, but they forced me into my safety school, saying the other wasn't in their budget. That was a lie. They had the money, but they prioritized my brother's private school so he could be with his friends. And here's the kicker, it was my brother's idea. At just 14, he suggested that my parents manipulate me into giving up my dream school, also he could have what he wanted. I didn't even realize he hadn't been going to public school like I did. They hid it from me completely, and because I only came home during holidays, it was easy for them to lie. By the time I graduated, he had too, so the timelines lined up and I never noticed. My parents were willing to sacrifice my future, my education, everything, just to keep him happy. And my uncle? He stayed silent because he thought it wasn't his business. I was stunned. But then he sent me proof years of transfer receipts to my mom during my college years. It hit me like a ton of bricks. All those times my parents rubbed it in my face about owing them, they hadn't contributed a dime. I'd essentially been paying back my uncle, not them. The manipulation was disgusting. They guilt-tripped me at every disagreement, demanding I repay them in full right away, when in reality I didn't owe them a single cent. It's sickening to realize your own parents and sibling are capable of that level of cruelty, but that's exactly what my family has always been like. At that point, there were still a few days before the next mediation meeting, but I couldn't wait. I was too furious and too hurt to sit still. I decided to call my brother and confront him directly. But when I tried, I found out he'd blocked me. That only made me angrier. Fueled by rage, I decided to hit him where it would hurt the most, his ego. He's always tried to impress his wealthy friends and fit in with them, even at 24. I knew without a doubt he hadn't told them the truth about his situation, especially not about the lawsuit. So I tracked down a few of his close friends after some heavy online digging, and once I had their contacts, I sent a mass text explaining everything. I didn't hold back. I laid out exactly what he had done, the money he'd stolen, and the mess he'd created. Honestly, the pettier the details, the better I felt about sending it. For a moment, it worked. I felt lighter. But the very next day, my mom started blowing up my phone with frantic messages, demanding I apologize and take everything back. Apparently, his friends had kicked him out once they realized he wasn't as financially stable as he pretended and that he was entangled in a legal dispute with his own sister. So just like him, his friends turned out to be shallow and pathetic, and frankly, I thought he got what he deserved. My mom, on the other hand, claimed I'd gone too far. She said I'd already ruined things by dragging him into court, and now I'd destroyed his friendships too. When I tried to confront her about what I'd just learned from my uncle, she went hysterical. I've never heard her scream like that in my life. It was almost unrecognizable, like she'd lost control completely. In the background, I could hear my brother throwing a tantrum, smashing things, while my dad tried to calm him down. The whole house sounded like chaos. For the first time, it felt like I had triggered a true breakdown in my family. And while part of me thought it should feel satisfying after everything they did to me, honestly, it didn't feel as good as I imagined. Now I keep wondering if I went too far by exposing him to his friends, even though he scammed me more times than I can count. By that point, the lawsuit was already underway, and my brother's so-called friends ended up kicking him out. Update 1. Quick update: I'm at work, so I'll keep this short. I got an email from one of my brother's old friends. They said the reason they threw him out wasn't because he wasn't as rich as them, but because he'd been lying to them for years. Apparently, he went out of his way to show off, spending ridiculous amounts of money just to act wealthier than he really was. They'd even come over to our house a few times and were shocked at how modestly we lived, considering how much money my brother pretended we had. To cover it up, he told them our parents were just low-key and didn't want to look snobby. And the wild part? My parents played right along with the charade. I don't know whether to laugh at how pathetic that is or just feel embarrassed by how desperate they all were for validation. His friends actually thanked me for exposing him. They told me if he could scam his own sister just to brag about his lifestyle, there was nothing stopping him from doing the same thing to them one day. At least in some small way, I guess I did something good. It's been 2 days since my mom's meltdown, and she hasn't texted me since. We're supposed to meet again in 4 days for mediation. If nothing gets resolved then, it'll go to trial. The thought of my brother getting totally wrecked in court is tempting, but it also means more legal fees for me. My lawyer is a close friend, so she's charging me less than usual, but it's still expensive. I honestly don't know if pushing this all the way to trial is the smartest move for me, but after exposing him, I doubt my family is backing down. Update 2. This one's fresh. Less than 24 hours after the last update, my whole family showed up at my apartment. No lawyers, no paperwork, just them, looking like an angry mob without the pitchforks. I refused to let them inside and kept the conversation in the hallway. I didn't trust any of them, especially not my brother. The last time I heard from him, he was smashing things like a toddler denied candy, and I wasn't about to let him tear up my place. I turned on the recorder on my phone and captured everything they said. My parents tried pulling the emotional blackmail card, begging me to settle for way less than what was stolen, around $5,000, because this whole mess was apparently destroying my poor little brother's mental health. Then he tried playing the changed man act, saying he was trying to clean up his life and needed my help. I didn't buy a word of it. They could absolutely afford to pay me back, but they didn't want to. They were being greedy and selfish, and I wasn't about to give in. I told them flat out I wasn't settling, and if they showed up again without my lawyer present, I'd call the cops. That's when my brother lost it and kicked my front door so hard it splintered the wood. It held together, but the damage was obvious. I recorded that too, along with his parting words where he threatened that I'd pay for this. My lawyer later told me the recordings and security camera footage were more than enough proof, so I didn't need to file a police report right away. Update 3. 3 weeks later, I realized I never shared the outcome. At our next mediation session, I laid out all the evidence, recordings of the threats, proof of them trying to intimidate me into settling, even the damage to my door. I told them straight up that I was ready to push this to trial and have my brother face prison time. That's when it finally clicked for them that I wasn't bluffing. They gave in and agreed to pay me back every cent, plus cover the cost of fixing my door. Petty? Maybe. Satisfying? Absolutely. On top of that, I got a restraining order against them, because with my brother's history of lies, tantrums, and threats, I wasn't taking any chances. Instead of sending money through my mom to repay my uncle, I now send it directly. I cut her out of the equation completely. Life has been hectic, but lighter too. I don't carry the weight of my toxic family anymore. I've heard they're telling everyone in the extended family their own twisted version of what happened, but so far, it's not working. Most people don't believe them, because everyone already knows they're self-victimizing narcissists. I finally call them out for what they are, and honestly, I'd do it again without hesitation.